Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome again to my Reservoir Lab channel. So, our today's knowledge sharing will continue focus on the tight gas. Okay. Over the last few years, a lot of work had been done on tight gas and challenge some of the existing thoughts and paradigm. So our today's knowledge sharing kind of literature overview and discussion some thoughts on the state of the fluid saturation in tight gas reservoir, particularly in Green River Basin in Wyoming, Colorado. As I put on my title, two different book, AEPG Memoir 107 published in 2014, and the second book talking about the Jonah Field AEPG study 2004, number 57. I think these two different book is quite famous, interested, especially chapter 10 and 11. Both of them explain bit detail on the focus petrophysical part. It's highlight the need to address some key issue related to the widespread occurrence of the gas show compared to the limited commercial production, as well as the puzzling absence of high water saturation zone despite the presence of water bearing formation. And understanding this fluid saturation dynamic, I believe, is very crucial for risk assessment and resource appraisal in tight gas reservoir. And of course, this is a good analog also similarly to the complex one of the field geoclastic in Kingdom. Some of that work has largely focused on the Green River Basin and Wyoming because it's a great data set, and it's also have very large yet to find resource that has been described to that basin. And some of the work that had been done has focused on what they think and the more conventional aspect of what are classically called this basin center gas province, and they have talked about how the impact our thoughts on risk and resource appraisal. And from the unconventional side, I actually talk quite a bit about the impact on stress evac and multi-phase flow in this very tight gas sand. But all the work didn't deal with some very key issue, I believe. And so what I would like to do is list some of those key issues that they didn't really get around dealing with. One of the most, why do we get such widespread gas show in this basin when the actual commercial production is much more highly restricted, regardless of whether you are inside a trap or outside of the trap. Why do so many of our water bearing zones not look wet? Very rarely see high water saturation, yet they have a lot of example of the zone and formation that will produce water as long as we care to track it. Why do we have high resistivity in deeper part of the basin, yet the production is not really extensive? And in some of the basin, it's caused people to build play concept around that. And why this basin don't saturation height function work terribly well when number of people also work in other province tertiary basin, saturation height function were not great. But we really struggled to make that concept work in some of this province. And why does it rock typing work all that well? Beyond some very broad statement and generalization, they don't really have the performance prediction confidence in this tight gas basin. They do in many these tertiary basin province. So why is that? Why isn't saturation driven petrophysics all good at discriminating the quality production? We are still doing an awful lot of formation evaluation when perforating gun in this province. They drills number of wells to TD running casing, find out how it's going to do after they have taken time, the money to try and stimulate everything as they can. But along the way, from using log analysis as a tool to decide whether or not to running casing to begin with, and many of these promises, and finally, how did gas into this very tight gas rock? Okay, now we are going to focus works largely here in the Green River Basin, Southwest Wyoming. Again, because it's got a great data set, but we have also worked in this basin, Colorado, in Denver Basin, but limited or not done yet in San Juan Basin in the south, unfortunately. But we think a lot of what we are going to share and with apply across the broad spectrum of the basin and probably applies up here in the Western Canada in case we have to leave early, not that ever happen at lunch. But in case we do this, that's what we are going to wind up. Most of the bays in the western part of the North America have undergone a phase of early gas chart somewhere in the 45, 60 million years ago range. And that was followed by the pace of late structurally uplift and reorganization. Sometimes a lot more people organization, sometimes less, but that occur somewhere in the say 10 to 5 million year range. At the time of that, hydrocarbon chart most of the tight gas reservoir, people don't think that we are our tight gas sands at all. They were charted well before the ever reached the maximum burial depth of burial, and the porosity may have been twice what we find today. And the perm may have been 10 to 1,000 times millidarcy what we find today. But it was during that burial phase, the pore volume decreased. Our reservoir become tight gas sandstone, and our gas column start increase greatly in thickness. And it was during the uplift and reorganization phase that our gas column increased again. And they responded to the changing of geometry because of the uplift. Some of our traps spilled, some of our trap retained the gas. But importantly, most of the capillary system departed from the primary drainage mode and went into something like secondary drainage or higher, or maybe even into the imbibition cycle. Okay, large areas of the basin we think are sitting on something approaching something like a residual gas saturation, and distinguishing residual gas saturation and economic pay is top core. I'll show some data in few moments that the residual gas saturation can range between 30 and 70% water saturation. So it's look a lot like pay, okay? Most of the reservoir are probably not in primary drainage mode. This present a big challenge on the petrophysical side just because virtually everything we do in petrophysics is predicted on being on primary drainage profile somewhere. It's only that condition that saturation height function work. It's only under those conditions that Pictet plot, buckle plots, and the large range of water saturation equation. We have truly worked in a predictive mode, and it's only the world that rock typing works in predictive status. But this view that we are going to share with you explain a whole series of disparate data set, and it explained it in the context of the basin history that most of these basins have undergone, and it's also explained why we have some very late trap that work. So that's sort of where I'm going to talk about it. So to get there, we would like to share with you some few, or I would like to look at some of the log, of course. First of some of these more water productive zone. Then I would like to look at some of saturation height data itself, and then we are going to start tying all of this together. Okay. Well, I think this is Green River Basin. We have zone that's called Erickson. And this is a typical of in the Erickson. It looks like gamma ray on the left. And for the operator who drill the Ericssons, you get some gas show all the time. Sometimes very substantial gas show. This I think 40, 50 ohm meters just for visual reference. But we have some clean sand, of course. We have fairly high resistivity. We have some gas crossover. We have gas show. And when we go in and try to complete this zone, they produce dominantly water. And they will produce water until you are tired of hauling it away. Okay, sometimes with just a little bit of the gas and sometimes with no gas at all. And some of the larger companies in the basin, their staff will come in and drill wells into the Erickson, and they will see the log like this, and they will complete them, of course, and they will make water. They will do for maybe 4, 5 wells in a row. Then they'll start to say, well, I think I'm not quite sure why this is going on this way, but I'm smart enough to learn. And so we are going to stop doing this, and then the companies in their infinite wisdom will start to rotate the stuff out and replace them with others, and the new stuff will come. And if they look at those well and go, well, those knucklehead look at all this gas and they didn't find, we can do better than that. And so they will do 4 and 5 wells worth, and they will say, well, I don't know why it's worked this way, but I'm going to stop this too. And about the time they get rotated out and doesn't happen up here now, but it's happened a lot down somewhere there. Here is another well in the Green River Basin. This is Erickson, which was we call almond interval. The almond is widespread gas reservoir, very typical well. I'm showing this to you because it illustrates the gas bearing zone up here. And this zone was part of the pour, and the well was completed sand up here. And this sand down here, roughly comparable porosity and roughly comparable resistivity, okay? They both have gas crossover, but this make gas and this make water. And we don't understand that. And with the advent of oil production logging lately, which look fairly similar on the logs, but which make a wide range of fluids. And we struggle with this. And if we were to show you another, if I were to show you another example in the Lewis slightly shallower horizon, I think we have gas and water out of this sort of the sand, and we have water out this sort sand, and we have gas out of this sort of the sand. Okay, so the questions become after a while when we calculate the saturation, and I don't care whose model that you are using, but if we calculate the saturation, is that reasonable estimate of what going in the reservoir? Does it start to describe the state of the saturation? And if it does, then why do we have this problem? Why do we have such hard time predicting and understanding water? And why don't we predict performance better? And so to do that, I want to walk through some element which will relate to how do desaturation. So here another well, Ericsson, and at the bottom half and top half and the top half. It illustrates values that were used in this particular log model for RW, use of the 2 and the MN values. And in this case, this is all backed up by actual water data, by the lab data. But when we do this, we went out with the PE, photoelectrical absorption, indicate by this PE flags down here on the lower right in the Harrison, and PE up here in the upper part. Yet we know that PE in the aeration is not real. We have been rotating people in and out, that we have been that has been constantly produce some water. So if we ask ourselves, what would it take to make that water disappear and go away? What sort of parameters would we have to look at? And our two big knobs to play with would be to take M and N and start increasing them. And I'll show you some data in a moment that would fly in the face of data that's being collected, or start thinking about the water. So if you were to make the water a bit fresher, we could begin to limit, we could begin to take away some of the pay, okay? But we would be going to pretty fresher water. But if you want it all to go away, then we start having to get to the water that's perfectly drinkable. And more importantly, if you start thinking about what is doing sort of picket space, you would be driving the ROI, and up here, you would be leaving much of the zone at saturation, add to the water saturation as so high, and George Piquet would just scream, and you would be calling on the water that we have never seen. And okay, these are the waters that we are routinely recover from these three different zones. But to make it that pay go away, we would have to say that there's water somewhere up here. We have yet to sample in this, and despite the fact that we drill out about maybe more than 20,000 well in the space, but there are people who would to do that. Okay, there are people who would say that the water saturation that we are calculating are not accurate, and there is a wide range of a reason. They would say that the RW values that we are using are wrong, that formation water are actually much fresher than what we really recover through some way that fluids are partitioned in the subsurface. So that bounce fluids are much fresher than the mobile fluid, and I'm not quite sure how that's worked in their mind. But I have heard that explanation many times. Some of people will say that MNN values that we are using should be much higher than what we are using. This is tight gas sand reservoir. Okay, we have isolated pore, sheet-like pore throat, and this large secondary pore should drive M up. And I'll show you some of the data on that a minute. And some people will look all the gas crossover, and all that gas crossover, and say that's not real. It's not responding to the gas or something. There is something else going on, and they will often point to the boron or something another specific cause of the exotic minerals. So nobody found much borons in the reservoir. Let's sort of change that sort of doubt of those thoughts for the moment. And look for just a bit at the issue of saturation and height. And so we are going to look at a series of the well, and we are going to filter the data back and try get us to look at the saturation is as close to a single rock type as we can get, knowing that we probably never really get to the pure single rock type. So this well in the Jonah field, it's produced across this interval about 1,700 foot thick interval. Here we are showing all the value on water saturation plot, which for the porosity exceeds more than 60%. And you start to get this sand, and there's a dominant trend running right through here. And if we start to filter that back again, maybe look at just the better than 80%, and look at better quality of the rock. It tightens the data spread up a little bit, and if we sort of narrow the range, then we start to get a cluster. Okay. Finally, where we settle was, let's look at about 1% porosity range through here. And look at the values, and what we see, they all range between 30 and 50% across the 2,500 foot of the section. There is no real increase in water saturation with depth. And if we start thinking about how this would look on drainage capillary pressure curve, it's hard to figure out where this might fit. And we will do that exercise here in just a minute. Well, if we take well that outside of the field of the Alas well, I was looking at was inside in the field of the Jonah has large multi TGF 8 to 60 TGF field. There's much about 1,212 in the field by now. This well that's about half mile outside of the field, and if we go through to some exercise, that we will find the trend in water saturation in short of bulk shifted about 10% point of the right, but there is no real saturation height relationship there. This is hard to fit. This is an series of capillary pressure curve as well. And yet this well here produce virtually no gas and produce some water. And if we do this and other basin, make it comparison, then we can do this around the basin in the United States. This isn't a Permian basin, I believe, and on Slat Exxon well, and we go through to the same exercise. This is what the data looks like. Okay, across about 3,000 feet of productive section. And we can do this in virtually all the top of the gas province in the United States, get very similar result. We don't see the trend that tell us that the saturation and height are closely linked. And so what we are trying to do is we are trying to look at this data over here. And say if this running about 30 to 35% water saturation, and this is the family of capillary pressure curve that describe the rock reservoir rock over here, then where on this family of the curve could we fit about 2,500 feet at about 35% water saturation with that sort of the slope. And so if we look at here, it doesn't fit here in anywhere. The only real place that we can get slope like this way up here is very high end capillary pressure curve, where the curve become asymptotic. And that would be the extraordinarily of low water saturation. If we look at dry hole wells and the same problem, it just shifted over slightly to the right, where on the cap curve, could we get that much interval about I think 50% water saturation? It's hard to see where those fit. Well, it's apparent disconnect between log drive saturation and performance, and lack of understanding on saturation height has caused a lot of problem and has caused a lot of people to wonder about the validity of the M and N or M star N star, depending on which one those road you want to go down. This caused a lot of gnashing of teeth over whether we are using the right saturation model, whether you should be using a Waxman-Smith or perhaps dual water model, or maybe we need yet to new develop a Salisan model. This caused a lot of frustration with the use of capillary pressure data in anything more than a very qualitative sense. And this caused a lot of frustration with the use of Picat plot and buckle plot. Okay, it caused some of the use RW value that are fresher to try and drive the saturation and the direction that people think they should be. Okay, and it's caused a lot of data collection by the industry to try better understand this, and many of us, I'm sure, as a part of the core lab and tight gas team, which a lot part is driven by a series problem originally. Now we have learned a lot of interesting stuff from this lab data, but it hasn't changed our perception of water saturation. If anything, we are getting data back from the lab that's suggesting the M and N ought to be going lower, not higher. So for example, here's recent data set that's online. It just went online about a month ago, based on several 1,000 samples of M versus porosity from series of tight gas sand, and it clearly show a drop as porosity drop. And that's going to drive the saturation in the wrong direction for our little problem. Okay, well, fundamental to this problem that we have of not distinguishing water production well from pay, fundamental that problem is that the water saturation themselves should be higher in this zone. We just haven't figured out what is the parameter of fault. If we had the right data, or if we have a better log model, or if somebody could invent a better Salisan model for us, it would all be made clear to us. And sitting behind that, that is notion that we have the right paradigm. We just were struggling because of the rock are so tight. It's hard to collect this sort of data in the lab, but if we keep hammering away at this problem, for sure we will eventually get there. But what if our paradigm isn't right to begin with? Fundamental, the notion of all this is that you are somewhere on capillary pressure drainage curve on the primary drainage curve for your rock type. That the reservoir is in the state of the primary drainage equilibrium. In that word, saturation and height are closely linked, and saturation performance are well led, a bit late. But if the assumption itself is off, then all bets are off. And so where we have come to is that perhaps all our data is approximately correct. Our M and N that's we are using are about right. Our RW values, the water salinities that we are capturing and using are all about the correct. when we calculate water saturation, we say that is 35%, for example. It's not 85%, might be 30, might be 40, but it's not 85, it's not 90. We are not far off. We think that the real problem is lies on our capillary pressure model. In that world, the petrophysics side, all bets come off. What is the most one of the most of our reservoir are not in primary drainage equilibrium. What if they are in a mode of neither having a secondary or drainage curve on the imbibition curve? So saturation height are no longer links. We can have multiple data set. We can have multiple capillary pressure at single value of saturation. Many of us could have multiple outcome for any given saturation value, and all of our disparate data set could start to coexist. So let's look at that. Why would we sort of rationally head down the road? Well, the reason is that in the base of the history, the basin were charted early and they underwent uplift the next generation later. So they were charted in the 45, 60 million years ago. Then they have been exhumed in the last 10. Okay, so the model we are going to explore suggests that the proceeds were much higher and the perm were much higher. And during that burial, the reservoir become tight, then our gas column start to increase in the thickness. During the uplift, the gas expanded, our gas column increased in the height again, and our traps began to reorient themselves. And as the trap reoriented themselves, the gas responded that, and the capillary system departed from being a primary drainage. So let's look at some data that would sort of go with that sort of the thoughts. This is Green River Basin. So we are looking at 3 different wells: Eagle Nest, Adobe Town, and Wagon Wheel. 3 different source of 3 different source rock package: the Maury, Baxter, and the Mesa Verde. And the timing plots for when they generated oil gas, and when the oil is converted to the gas. And if we look at this plot, we might see the peak of oil generation is somewhere I think 45, 65 million range. Peak oil to the gas is somewhere 35 to 55 range at various specialty around the basin. But importantly, most of the gas that we get to play with is in a play the basin before the basin uplifts and or become exhumed. If we look at the burial history plot for the basin, this red bar here, reservoir interval, that we are tracking, then we can see that the reservoir interval is quite shallow when our source rock are generating large volume of hydrocarbon. And in fact, it's during the uplift that the hydrocarbon generation is essentially shut down. Then let's illustrate it's better on the plot like this, which look at the time at the bottom versus the volume of what hydrocarbon expelled. And essentially, we get this large expulsion peak here, really diminish off in time. That's long before this reservoir have gotten close to the maximum depth of the burial. Now, the guy who did some of this work, I think Bob Koske, 2004. And when Bob was doing his basin modeling, he did calibration his basin model to the bottom hole temperatures filtering reflectant that is very standard based on the modeling practice. But what he also did, I think it wasn't quite so standard, was he built a porosity evolution part of his model. That's the solid line running through here as compared to the porosity that observed in the wells at the end of the model run. It's get pretty good match. And what that led him do was to build a plot like this, which compared the timing and generative capacity of various source rock. That this line running down here against the porosity in the mid pole level of the reservoir that he was looking at, the Jonah field in this case. And so the blue line is tracking mid-pool porosity both for well inside Jonah. Then we will show in a moment a well further down deep, so we can look at this. I think what we can look at this, the steep slope in here sort of visually goes straight up and get an estimate of what mid-pool porosity was look like at the time of generation. Then we start to realize that the porosity, reservoir porosity could have been 15, 25 range percent. It's about 10% range. Now if we go and collect core, if we look at the source rock that are just down deep here, go through the same exercise, then we realize that the reservoir porosity could have been I think 70 to 30%. At the time the basin was being charted. Again, if we go and collect a core data, it's in the 10% range. Now, interestingly, when we look at the boreal, another boreal history plot out of here, Western Canada, they look very similar. The name are different, but other than that is very similar process. Then we get about to say, in the case, there's about 1,500 meters of uplift excavation taking place. So we are starting to think that maybe there is similar process is going on. So to explore this impact of have early chart, let's upload if we build a little model that tries to look at the effect of boreal and uplift on reservoir quality and capillary pressure, how would this translate into capillary pressure world? So in this particular case, we are going to chart a rock when it's buried to about 7,000 feet. We are going to bury it down about 14,000 feet below. We are then going to uplift about 9,500. And let's sort of think about what would mean in the capillary pressure world. And in the windland world, it means that you are going to chart a good rock type 1, and you are going to drive it down in the southwest. And this diagram went up with a very typical type of gas reservoir today. Now, if we build some pseudo capillary pressure curve for this, it will look like this. We would be charging this really good looking rock down here. But the core that you would go and collect from your well tomorrow would be this much less favorable looking rock here. So we are starting to think about that. that we are not charging the rock that we are getting core sample from. We are charging rock that's much better looking down here. And somehow those rocks are changing into this tight gas sand. It would be as if we were to chart this very good looking rock with what could have been a fairly modest gas column. As you bury this rock, as the pore volume decrease, in the gas column increase, our saturation point migrate to the northeast. So we are not trying to chart a tight rock. We are not so looking at the saturation values, wondering how did I get gas into the tight rock? Maybe I did. I put in something much better, and suddenly much better looking and a low basin history to drive the point to the northeast. Okay, so how would this translate into the subsurface? And to do that, we are sort of built little series of the model, and the illustration here in the lower right. When we did this, we had a fluvial reservoir trap in mind, but we could put any sort of trap in here. This is just purely to get the concept across. So what if we chart earlier and we have a sand body here? We are going to chart just here, and the upper portion to have a sandbar structurally up deep, and this model is to the right. Okay, and so to make this sample, to make this simple, this is all one rock type reservoir, and so our well going to fall out based on that drainage capillary pressure curve. The gas displaces the water as drainage process in that wood saturation height closely linked. Then we are going to bury it down somewhere here. As we bury it, we are going to decrease the pore volume because of diagenesis of the reservoir. As we do that, our capillary pressure are going to increase, and so our rock type is going to evolve into this direction. And so we are going to end up pushing gas in this direction here. And so wells which were formerly outside of our original trap now is going to come into the trap. They're still going to line up largely based on the capillary pressure curve here. Okay, now let's look at the uplift side. We have considered that what happened on the boreal side is sort of the dynamic world. Now let's look at what's happened if we uplift the base. If you ask how much uplift in the Green River Basin, this is the sort of data that we end up working with, the RO, data versus depth, and we end up projecting them back to the RO about 0.2. It's easy to end up with estimate the range between 3,800 feet, okay, of uplift and exhumation. That's in about the last 100 million years ago. And it's very specially around the basin during that uplift, during that excavation. As the basin evolved, then we think some of our trap would have spilled completely. Some of our trap would have readjusted that the new geometric position, and there's probably a few traps that just stay exactly the same. So in this case, we have done as we have taken up deep well, and now move into the upper left, and so basically tilted to this some sand body. And so what's going to happen is that gas column, which used to be oriented like this, is now going to switch around, be oriented like this. And so there are wells which used to be in the gas column, which are now out, and wells which used to be out that now in. Okay, and we are going to come back and explore this data a little bit, but it's going to start creating a very complex world in the subsurface. In that change in the position of the gas would be both drainage process, and some places over there where the gas would be displacing water, and over here we would have water displacing gas. That's an imbibition process. So let's talk about the imbibition and tight gas. If we are not familiar with it, it's displacing non-wetting phase with the wetting phase. And a lot of work done up here, particularly by, I think, Normwood Law. Some show that very dependent on the pore geometry, and particularly by the pore throat to the pore to pore size aspect ratio. The more complex of the pore geometry, the higher the residual saturation, as a gross short of the statement. Okay, snap of which is the creation, the residual saturation is very favorable in highly water wet system, a very high pore aspect system that, and we are going to look at some in a minute. But if we look at in the imbibition curve and the capillary pressure, they are very steep. So the impact of all this, we are going to take as, it's not going to start creating a world where saturation height function are very difficult, but we could have very steep relationship. And it's going to mean that we could have reservoir at residual saturation and have no capillary pressure support. Okay, now we look at on that point of the view. So what these things look like this, drainage and imbibition. I think this is Pinedale Reservoir rock, where it was taken up to full entry, then out here in the blue. The difference between two paths in the hysteresis, but notice that the imbibition curve is much steeper than the drainage curve. In this case, the final residual saturation for, I think, is 28% water saturation. But there's no connected gas in the pore space. But it's at 28% water saturation. Okay, the shape of this imbibition curve and where it's wind up as a function of the starting point and the function of the pore geometry. So let's continue again. So, so the work done here, largely of Paleozoic carbonate reservoir is sort of work behind this, but Normwood Law show that if you have high aspect ratio system and you have highly core data system, okay, they are going to win up with high residual saturation. Well, in tight gas reservoir, this is exactly what we have, and we know that because when we look at them in the under thin section, these are our sheets like pore throat system. This what pore connecting this large secondary pore are high aspect ratio pore system that give us the very strong relationship between stress and permeability. This what give us data set like this. where when we take the sample, apply stress to it, and in this case we went from 8,000, 2,000 up to 4,000 psi stress. Then we decrease the perm by 1 to 2 orders magnitude. But we hardly change the pore volume at all. That's because it's very high aspect ratio pore system. And when we actually do scan curve on tight gas, which is what we did here in the case we took a single sample, we took it through 3 cycles of drainage imbibition. This is tight gas sample. It's about 11.5% porosity, about 43 micro Darcy of perm. So we took the sample, we decreased saturation to the point there, then allow it to come back here and imbibe all the way down to the residual. Then we saturated to this point somewhere here, allow to imbibe and so forth to the final point there. There are something to notice on this. If we look at the drainage, at the secondary drainage, the imbibition curve, they were very steep concerning saturation, much more so than the primary drainage curve, which is true going curve. Okay, that start to look a lot like some of those saturation height trends that built in all this field, where we see essentially unchanging saturation with height regardless of their productivity. And in this case here, we could just in the case 75% 75% water saturation or 45% water saturation, or even going to 35 water saturation and 0 capillary pressure, depending on where you saturated it at the beginning and how far you drain it. It's suggested that if I had 55% water saturation log, I wouldn't know whether I'm at the bottom or at the top. Essentially have an infinite series of outcome at any given saturation depending on the basin history. That start to sound a lot like wells we have. So if you look at this at the pore scale sort of things about what's happening on the drainage side, the gas infit or it eventually get messed up, buoyancy pressure can enter the pore, and there's a sudden Heinz jumps as it filled neck pore body. That's the drainage cycle. In the imbibition side, as this wetting film grows in thickness, it reaches point where it suddenly snaps off, leaving gas in the pore bodies that is not connected. The gas is there, but it's not connected anymore. The capillary pressure has gone down to the 0 in this case. So what does residual gas looks like in the tight gas? So to look at this, we did couple series of measurement. One way we collected a lot of scanning data was those multi-loop curve we show you just a moment ago, and we also collected data from some other counter currents in addition to working in the lab. We plotted versus the permeability. And so we have a lot of the reservoir that are down here, less than 0.1 millidarcy. And what it say that residual saturation could range about 25% water saturation. It's about 85% water saturation. So think about 25% water saturation, no capillary pressure. That means we could, we could drill wells. We could get gas show. We could get tremendous gas show. Then we could run our log. Then we can get 25% water saturation and go and complete the well. It will produce water until we are tired of holy water, that gas in the pore space, but it's not connected. It also means that the same value, we can have a small column of gas. So we can get small outcome, or you can have very large column of the gas and get very large outcome, or you get anything in the between. If we look at residual saturation, this is a function of starting saturation. Where we departed the drainage curve as it is where you wound up. So this plot the initial wetting phase, wetting phase saturation along the bottom, how far we took it on the drainage side to the residual saturation on the y-axis. And what we see that when we get down sort of at less than 55% initial water saturation, we could have residual saturation that range from high about 70% to low about 20% water saturation is bothersome. So let's go back to our little cartoons earlier. During uplift, as the gas column respond to the gas changing structural geometry, we have wells that have moved in or out of the gas column. For example, wells 1 and wells 2 up here on the right used to be relatively high in our first gas column, but now rotated them out. So wells 1 and 2, which used to be high on the drainage curve, have come down to the imbibition curve. In the case of the well, water has come part way down. And in this case of the well 2, it's come a lot further down. Well number 3, which used to be low in the original gas column over here, is now quite high. And actually, well 3 is moved up. Well 4 used to be low, it is now higher. And as well as 4 here. Excuse me, what is here? It has moved up here. Well 5 used to be in the gas column, is now out. So 5 is here. It is come all the way down this innovation curve, and well 6 used to be completely out of thing, is now right. They are in the thick of it, and so well 6 is here. So you look at this, you begin to realize that within a narrow range of saturation, I have wide range of outcome. Let's start to look at the star. Sorry. Let's start to look at a lot like the sort of maps we make. Then in this field where we use saturation as the discriminator, it's become poor. So all these well drills in the little trap would all give gas show while drilling. They would all calculate pay within very narrow range of saturation. Some of the well would make gas with a little bit of water or no water at all, and some of the well would make gas with a lot of water, and some of them will, and some of the and some of them will, and some of the wells would make water with very little gas. It wouldn't be all clear as to why that is happen. So maybe when we look at a well like this, where we have the erection and the top of almond, the almond is a large gas pool reservoir. In this case, erection makes mixed water. Maybe the reason that our logs are doing this, maybe the reason that we are calculating the sort of thing that we are doesn't, there's no because, not because there is a problem with the value, is there is nothing wrong with the values that we are using in terms of water salinity or the electrical parameters. Maybe it's because we have an interval that isn't something close to the residual water saturation. Maybe that's why it's behaving the way it is. And so the gas, what we see here is real. The log are measuring what in the pore space, and this gas is pore space is not connected. That's the problem with it. The drill bits show that we are getting a real, we are actually seeing this gas flow, gas show, we are actually measuring this stuff, but we are sitting at the residual saturation instead of sitting on the primary curve. Maybe the reason that our capillary pressure height function, maybe the reason saturation height function don't work well in many days of province is because the saturation trend, which are largely vertical, telling us that we are not on drainage profile curve at all. We shouldn't be looking at the curve like this. We should be thinking in terms of the imposition side or secondary drainage or higher, and we are sitting on that short of the curve. And so instead of looking at our capillary pressure data or looking at our saturation, thinking that the reservoir are undersaturated, maybe we should be thinking that they are not in the primary drainage mode. So if we start to wrap up this up, many of the basin that we are talking about that are characterized early state and late uplift that threw up here in Canada, or it is down in the state. Many of us believe reservoir interval were charted well before they reach maximum depth of burial. And in that mode, it's highly they have much higher porosity, much higher perm than what we find today. I think it's mistake to look at the core data that we get today and begin this exercise, which have been done for years of wondering how we got good gas in such tight rock. We must have had a column that was absolutely enormous to get gas into this micro darcy rock. Well, maybe we didn't put it into micro darcy rock to begin with. Okay, it was the burial process that caused the pore volume to decrease, and it was the same burial process that caused of the gas column to begin increasing as effectively takes some number of moles of gas spread it out over much less pore volume. And during the uplift, the gas column adjusts structurally to that uplifting process, and in some cases they spill and went to residual. In some cases we have long range, we have zone in which gas is migrating over long distance. At the leading edge of the migrating front of the gas is drainage process as gas displaces water, but at the trailing edge of the migrating gas, it's imposition process, it's water redisplacing gas, it doesn't go back 100%. Water after the gas has migrated through it goes to the residual gas saturation, which would create large areas of basin that are high resistivity. And that give gas show, but doesn't produce economic volumes everywhere. Whoa. Well, what should we care about this? This say that there are large areas of the basin that could be something like residual or something approaching residual saturation that could look like pay. So we need to begin thinking how we might distinguish residual saturation from something much more economically interesting. That's a big challenge on the petrophysical side, on the formation evaluation, just because most of the tool that we use, their underlying their base value, most of the tool are predicted on being on the primary drainage curve. It's never said quite that way. But what underlies almost all the log analysis that we are on the primary drainage curve, it's only that wood of picket plot, buckle plots is really works well. And saturation height doesn't work well in this province, but this sort of view begins to explain why we get the show where we do, that explain why we have short hard time relating saturation driven relationship and performance. It explain why late traps work, and to suggest that we really need to focus intensely understanding this history. Understanding the history of our bases in our trap, then trying to distinguish residual saturation from economically interesting saturation. And if we could find a way to do that, that would be a step function change and how we do the formation evaluation of this basis. So with that, I think that's all our today's overview. Hope everybody enjoyed, and you might find something interested on this talk. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.